Hello and welcome to Manibil. This is a part of the deconstruction where I have jumped over a few chapters, and I might actually need to mention those chapters, so hang on a bit. These chapters are discussions on the idea of space and time and their divisibility or such. And these are called the first section 4. Excuse me for my rambling here. Section 4, objections answered, and section 5, the same subject continued within part 2, which is of the ideas of space and time. And it's about infinite divisibility of our ideas in space and time, and infinite divisibility of space and time, but as both space and time and our ideas of space and time. And again, this refers to Hume's idea that, or the Hume's understanding or ontology that states that there are impressions and ideas, and there's an impression of space, and there's an idea of space. And personally, I find this to be incorrect. I don't think there is an impression of space. I think that space, so to say, is already in mind, and that the idea of space is the experience of that structure in the mind. From the outside, without stating the axiom, I need to, maybe I should, right? Maybe I should say I work from the axiom that there is an outside that I do not have access to. So let's just, for now, let's stay with that, right? But that outside sort of bounces against my mind. And that bouncing is a kind of a signal, you could say. That itself is not the experience. But the mind creates the experience I have of spatiality from these signals. And these are represented as colors and sounds and tastes and so on. Now you could say that space is mainly about colors. And I would agree, right? I personally, and that's why he also said in a previous chapter that sight is a sort of a special case of sensation, right? That is used to create the content in space. I'm not talking a space as, the solar system or universe or anything like that, right? I'm talking about the notion of distance, and so depth and whatever term you wanna. It's the notion of it. It's not the whole thing as such as a label, but it's the notion of it, right? And of course there is a notion of it, but I think it's completely disconnected from impressions and ideas. The impression I have is the color, but that's a specific kind of signal from that outside, right? That is then slapped on the scaffolding called space, and then I experience that spatiality. That's why it's impossible to, and I can abstract all sorts of ideas from this from this notion of space, and I can create infinity and infinitesimally small and things like that, right? And the Planck length, I don't know, the sort of technical scientific stuff, right? And it's because that space is already inherent in my system that, it takes a while for a child to adapt to, let's say, using their eyes, understanding concept and so on, but they cannot at the same time be developing space, in my opinion, right? Space has to be there already in the mind in order for this thing to work. This is probably just, I'm fabulating. I'm just trying to come up with, ideas, thoughts. This is not my philosophy as such, because I don't really care about it, right? I don't, and I can't see why it's so important for this philosophy of his to dive so deep into space and time. Maybe it's because we are at the early end of the Enlightenment, and Newtonian physics is very important to him and is sort of a core aspect of this particular philosophy, the subtitle of the book, right? That it's very important to settle on some kind of understanding of these aspects for him to go further. But I would say that section 4 and 5 is, your own homeschooling, right? I won't, and they're fairly long. Let me see the audiobook lengths are. There are 42 minutes of audiobook on objections answers, and there's 36 on the same subject continued. So there are almost 80 minutes of objections answered to infinity and divisibility and space and time, right? There might be a few aspects here and there that are, interesting to grapple with, but in my opinion, it's not needed to go to the next chapter, which is the idea of existence and of external existence, right? That it's not necessarily necessary to go there to get to the next step. So I think this is sort of a polemic kind of, it's possibly something that is of huge importance back in the day, maybe. I don't know. I don't find it's something that, I might be wrong on this. I mean, maybe I'm always sort of, if Hume wants to discuss something, it's not like I don't take it seriously, but I still sort of, is it worth diving into here and spending 80 minutes or 3 or 4 parts at my end here to discuss these matters? And maybe I should just give you my, or I should suffice by stating how I approach the ideas of space and time and how it influences whatever. Let me put it this way. I don't think you could cognize or have any idea if you didn't have space. I don't know what the experience what it would be like if there weren't any space. I don't even think there would be an experience of any kind, right? I think there wouldn't be anything. And maybe space, the idea of space and spatiality in the mind, is that which ultimately creates cognition and awareness and so on. I don't know, right? But on the other hand, it seems like, it's not necessarily vision that has to be used. A bat uses sound waves because they don't have any light where they live in these caves or whatever, right? At least, and in the night and so on. That they can create some kind of spatiality or some functional experience that is based on sound. So maybe they see sound as colors, maybe, right? Who knows? But they possibly have a sense of space anyway. So if spatiality is built into the brain, it's just a matter of what you want to put on the scaffolding, right? What kind of movie you want to have presented there, right? So I think that's a fairly decent argument for why it's valid to say that space is already there. It's not a part of the experience as such. And it would also be more flexible, you could say, from an evolutionary standpoint, that you have space already. And then you can slap on that whatever you want, right? Is it sounds, is it tastes, is it whatever, right? Or a 6th or 7th or 8th kind of sense that I don't have, right? Wi-Fi signals. To quote, philosophize this, right? I might give a shout out to Philosophize This podcast. I used to follow him until the sort of modern day philosophy. I sort of stepped off the train there, right? But he's fairly entertaining, and I can recommend you to go and listen a bit to. After you watch all my videos, of course, right? Philosophize This. Okay. So I will probably upload the sound files so you can keep, if you use this as sort of a narrated kind of audiobook, then it would be nice that you have these parts also. So I will upload them. Since they are public domain, there should be no problem in me uploading them. And then you will just get to this point and listen to my deconstruction of section 6 and henceforth, right? So forth. And it is about the idea of existence and of external existence. And before I do that, I'm reminded that I try to remind myself to remember to say, okay, so at this point, we are dealing with the understanding of a potential outside reality of some kind, right? Now, this is how many pages into? Okay. We are, let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So this is the 13th chapter or section in Hume's book on a treatise of human nature, right? And these potentially, what was it, 13 I said? 13 chapters is what Bernardo Kastrup says, well, it's obvious, right? These 13 chapters that Hume has meticulously grinded through, right? Spending 80 minutes on about objections answered to ideas of space and time, right? It might be that space and time is the connection point between an external existence and his impressions and ideas, right? You need to have space and time. Otherwise, there wouldn't be anything you could call outside external, because external loses its meaning if there isn't any space. So maybe I'm answering the question I gave you in the last or the part before about why space and time necessarily has to be placed here. Maybe that's the whole point. So maybe I'm just stupid that I couldn't think my way to that, right? That external, it's a necessity to have a sense of space in order to have external. And now, I don't think Hume is trying to refute or try to prove the idea of space. I think he works from the axiom that there is space, but he talks about divisibility and so on, infinity and divisibility, right? As sort of an indirect way of saying space is not something I'm refuting, right? So he's taking it both as an idea and an impression. I think as I said, it's incorrect to take it as an impression, and it's not even an idea. It's just an aspect of the mind that is already there and which has been, colored up by the sense data, so to say, right? Okay. That's kind of incredible that the difference between Hume in this regard and Bernardo Kastrup says, of course there is an external, right? So these first two parts of his book 1 of Hume is basically unnecessary, according to Bernardo Kastrup, right? Why are you spending time on the origin of our ideas, division of the subject, ideas of the memory and imagination, connection and association of ideas, relations and modes and substances and abstract ideas, divisibility of time and space, and so on? Why are you spending a ton of time on that, Hume? You can just do as I do, as Bernardo Kastrup says. You can just say, of course it's there, right? So that might point to that Bernardo Kastrup isn't that good of a philosopher when the day is done, right? Okay, enough of that. Let's head into the thing.
File 15 of A Treatise of Human Nature by David Hume, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by George Yeager. Book 1, Part 2, Section 6 of the Idea of Existence and of External Existence. It may not be amiss before we leave this subject, to explain the ideas of existence and of external existence, which have their difficulties, as well as the ideas of space and time. By this means, we shall be the better prepared for the examination of knowledge and probability when we understand perfectly all those particular ideas which may enter into our reasoning. There is no impression nor idea of any kind of which we have any consciousness or memory that is not conceived as existent, and it is evident that from this consciousness the most perfect idea and assurance of being is derived. From hence we may form a dilemma the most clear and conclusive that can be imagined. That is, that since we never remember any idea or impression without attributing existence to it, the idea of existence must either be derived from a distinct impression conjoined with every perception or object of our thought, or must be the very same with the idea of the perception or object. As this dilemma is an evident consequence of the principle that every idea arises from a similar impression, so our decision betwixt the propositions of the dilemma is no more doubtful. So far from there being any distinct impression attending every impression and every idea, that I do not think there are any two distinct impressions which are inseparably conjoined. Though certain sensations may at one time be united, we quickly find they admit of a separation and may be presented apart. And thus, though every impression and idea we remember be considered as existent, the idea of existence is not derived from any particular impression. The idea of existence, then, is the very same with the idea of what we conceive to be existent. To reflect on anything simply and to reflect on it as existent are nothing different from each other. That idea, when conjoined with the idea of any object, makes no addition to it. Whatever we conceive to be existent. Any idea we please to form is the idea of a being, and the idea of a being is any idea we please to form.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is I was baffled. I was curious about him using the term conceive, and we have been also dealing with perceiving. So what's the difference between conceive and perceive, perception and conception? Now, concepts is what I sort of call an elephant, a concept, for instance, right? Is that a conception of an object? So a concept is what is concepted from the perception. Perception is there, and then I concept something from it, or using concepts in my understanding, right? So it's the perception is that which is there in a way, or at least to some extent, and concept is what I drag out of it for my own use. That's something like what I'm hearing, right? But he says that how he sees that, not necessarily himself, but at least the general understanding of existence is that all that I conceive is of an existence that is existent. What I call existence is what is existent, right? So it's like, okay, if concepts are that which exist, it is also existent, both in the sense that it's what there is, and it's also outside, right? And there's an interesting how he gets to any kind of, because then he's more or less implying the paradox that is sort of built into materialism, right?
Whoever opposes this must necessarily point out that distinct impression from which the idea of entity is derived, and must prove that this impression is inseparable from every perception we believe to be existent. This we may, without hesitation, conclude to be impossible.
I would like to take this one again. Whoever opposes this must necessarily point out that distinct impression from which the idea of entity is derived, and must prove that this impression is inseparable from every perception we believe to be existent. This we may, without hesitation, conclude to be impossible. So, what he's saying, there's a connection between having the experience and calling it existent. But what I'm hearing is that he's actually aware of the inside-outside potential paradoxical understanding, right?
Our foregoing reasoning in Part 1, Section 7, concerning the distinction of ideas without any real difference will not here serve us in any stead. That kind of distinction is founded on the different resemblances which the same simple idea may have to several different ideas. But no object can be presented resembling some object with respect to its existence and different from others in the same particular, since every object that is presented must necessarily be existent.
He likes to juggle these convoluted sentences, right? Sometimes it's a bit annoying. Okay, let me take it again. Our foregoing reasoning concerning the distinction of ideas without any real difference will not here serve us in any stead. That kind of distinction is founded on the different resemblances which the same idea may have to several different ideas. Yeah, okay, so this is, I think, about you can have various colors of birds. They are still birds, right? It's the same idea, but they have different qualia. Okay, but no object can be presented resembling some object with respect to its existence, and different from others in the same particular, since every object that is presented must necessarily be existent. I don't understand this argumentation. Every object that is presented, who says it's presented, Hume, right? It's like as if it's sort of there's some outside demon saying you need to know this, right? Get to know this, right? Robin Williams. Get to know this, huh? See, I give a cigarette to the child, huh? Get to know this. That is presented must necessarily be existent. Why must it necessarily be existent? Now I'm disappointed, right? There might be some impenetrable language barrier here, right? But since every object that is presented must necessarily be existent, this is problematic, right? Every object, maybe I shouldn't actually call it, since it's every object. This is a clear statement, right? Every object that is presented must necessarily be existent. This is bullshit, in my opinion. This is problematic. Every object that is presented, nothing is presented. Maybe it's like a game of terms here, right? But a presentation indicates a preordained meaning to some experience. Otherwise, you can't use the term presented, right? I present this to you because there's a given meaning you need to understand, right? Must necessarily be existent. Why must it be existent? You haven't clarified how you got to that existent, right? if that's by an external world of some kind that you're referring to. Maybe it's sort of a language barrier here, but I don't like this one at all, right?
A like reasoning will account for the idea of external existence. We may observe that it is universally allowed by philosophers and is, besides, pretty obvious of itself that nothing is ever really present with the mind but its perceptions or impressions and ideas, and that external objects become known to us only by those perceptions they occasion. To hate, to love, to think, to feel, to see, all this is nothing but to perceive. Now, since nothing is...
I want to highlight this one. Nothing is ever really present with the mind but its perceptions or impressions and ideas, and that external objects become known to us only by those perceptions they occasion. So he's saying that there's an outside that is presented to us, right? Maybe he has stated there is an outside, but he hasn't clarified how he gets to that there is an outside. I find that problematic. That needs to be argued for, right? It needs to be argued how you get to it. You can't just pretend that it's there, right? You have to account for every aspect that you're dealing with in your metaphysics, right? It has to be accounted for. How you get to it. You can't just bring it in, sort of, or pretend it's always been there. Or at least you have to say, I'm considering this to have always been there, right? It's sort of an axiomatic fashion, maybe, something along that I would do. I say, okay, I am working from my experience in being there, some kind of representation of an outside. But you have to state it. You have to state that that's how you do it. Otherwise, it's a pretense of it being derived somehow, or at least it could be understood as such. And to the best of my experience, you cannot derive anything from your experience out about something being outside that experience, right? And the inside-outside is a reference to some part of space, right? There's something outside my house, right? There's something outside my window, right? The idea of inside-outside is a description or something that is used to describe your experience, right? And if the experience is on the inside, then you're using some aspect of the inside to extend to some outside. Is that really allowed? Well, I don't think you can go beyond your own experience and talk about anything about that. And I'm not saying Hume is doing that, so we're still sort of on the borderline here, right? I'm trying to see if he's stepping into, forbidden area or he's staying put, right? But that is a big problem in philosophy because people are so readily jumping into, of course there is an outside, just like Bernardo Kastrup says, and then it's going to tell you all sorts of weird shit about what there is out there, right? That, yes, I think that it's impossible, at least for myself, to work with my experience without considering it some kind of representation of an outside, right? But that doesn't mean I can go and tell you anything about what is outside, right? I can treat my experience as a representation of an external world, right? But that doesn't mean I can go and tell you anything about that external world. Basically because what I have is that experience, right? And that's the important thing. I have that experience is in a functional manner because I cannot possibly grasp what is beyond my experience, right? Otherwise, that's the reason potentially why I have the experience, because that can work for me, right? So it's like, it's a surefire, in my opinion, sign of a kind of need for a philosophical safe space where you can go and fabulate and create all sorts of sort of, what would the term be? Safe space, where you can feel good and be a little snowflake and say, yeah, the big mind out there, whatever, is taking care of me. I just have to obey and do it. It's not my fault. Something like that, right? So it feels good. That is much more important, that world out there, than your sort of pathetic little weird individual experience. Who gives a crap, right? Useless eater, right? Where I'm completely opposite. I'm saying, leave it the fuck alone. Whatever you can come up with will always be some kind of abstraction from your own experiences. An abstraction from your experiences, which is by definition not the thing itself, cannot be any kind of description of that which that experience is based on, right? It's a freaky, dysfunctional kind of philosophy. So, and I'm rambling a bit, or I'm ranting a bit about in philosophers in general when it comes to this particular aspect that I find so important. To the deeper level you have, you always have to be rigid in your argumentation. But if you're not fucking clear in this particular part here, you're going to screw up the rest of the shit, right? Because you're not setting sufficient limitations on your own philosophy and where you want to go with it, right?
It's ever present to the mind, but perceptions, and since all ideas are derived from something antecedently present to the mind, it follows that it is impossible for us so much as to conceive or form an idea of anything specifically different from ideas and impressions. Let us fix our attention out of ourselves as much as possible. Let us chase our imagination to the heavens or to the utmost limits of the universe. We never really advance a step beyond ourselves, nor can conceive any kind of existence but those perceptions which have appeared in that narrow compass. This is the universe of the imagination. Nor have we any idea but what is there produced. The farthest we can go towards a conception of external objects when supposed specifically different from our perceptions is to form a relative idea of them without pretending to comprehend the related objects. Generally speaking, we do not suppose them specifically different, but only attribute to them different relations, connections, and durations. But of this more fully hereafter in Part 4, Section 2.
Okay, so what I'm hearing him saying is not that he's rejecting an external world, but he's saying you do not have access to it. And you can only start to imagine it, but in my opinion, he should be clearer and say, don't try to imagine anything, because all you can come up with is imagination. And that is a part of your mind, right? He has said that he's used the term imagination. So don't try to imagine anything. Don't encourage people to try to go there, right? Although it's sort of, it's tempting, right? Maybe by some magical kind of thinking I can use science, or then I can say something about it. No, you can't say anything about it. Exactly because you have an experience of it. It's because it's the best way maybe to argue why you can't go there. Because that which you are trying to talk about, you don't even know if it's there, right? Because you have an experience from which you then has sort of, without any deduction, has created an external world beyond that. And then you're trying to use that abstractions or ideas and imaginations or whatever models extracted from your experiences. That language you're using is a kind of extraction from the experience or description of it. And then you're trying to place that before it becomes the experience. I mean, it's crazy town, right? So instead of being hung up on what might be there, before it becomes your experience. Leave it the fuck alone, because you can't say anything about it anyway, right? At the end of the day, no matter what you can come up with that might be beyond your experiences, and that which the experiences might be a representation of, you can't change the experience anyway, right? And tomato is a tomato, right? Doesn't matter what you can come up with before it is appearing as a tomato to you. It's still the same old fucking tomato, right? You still have to go to the grocery stores and, whatever, to get that tomato or whatever, right? It's still the same story. It's the same thing going on in your actual reality, right? So what does it matter how it comes to be a tomato? Well, the obvious answer is it doesn't fucking matter, right? Unless you want to go into some kind of abstract, mental, safe space because you're so tired of the actual world you're living in that you want to go and hide there instead, right? And come up with all sorts of comforting, that was the word I was looking for before, comforting ideas and cushioning your pathetic loser life rather than taking a wrestle with the actual life, right? Go and hide there in your ideas of feminism or society or family or whatever, right? I'm not saying that you shouldn't take care of your children. That's not what I'm saying. But, extended family, right? Your society, government, right? Ideas of LGBT communities and, all these abstract ideas that has no standalone existence of any kind. That is sort of external to you, that you might conflate with this thing beyond your experiences, right? You're blurring the lines of what, it all ends up controlling you. And you are disarming yourself and becoming a slave to your own philosophy. That's what pisses me off, right? So, okay, I think we'll end here. It would be a good place to end this one. And I think I will head into another part just after this one to get started on part 3 of knowledge and probability. I can't wait. And I'm pretty satisfied with Hume's, though a little fluffy answer here, right? He spent, 80 minutes refuting ideas of incorrect ideas of time and space, but he's just sort of, I think you cannot say about something, cohesive about an external world. Okay, he does say, but of this more fully hereafter, part 4, section 2. So we will possibly get back to this. And so far, so good. I'm still on board. There are various limitations which I pointed out, but I think I'm in the general scheme of things, I'm completely still on board with Hume here, right? All right. Please share, like, and subscribe. Consider a donation or give me a comment below. And otherwise, see you in the next one.